Dorothy Ford stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1882, carrying one battered trunk, a sewing kit, and absolutely no illusions about what her life was going to look like from here on out. She had written the advertisement herself, sitting at her kitchen table back in Cincinnati, with her older sister Margaret leaning over her shoulder and clucking like a disapproving hen. The advertisement had read, "Widow, age 28, capable housekeeper and cook, experienced with livestock and garden, seeks position as housekeeper on working cattle ranch. Not given to fancies or complaints. Will work hard and expect fair wages." She had read it over twice, decided it was honest enough, and sent it to 3 newspapers. She had received 4 replies, and Warren Ellsworth's had been the most straightforward of the lot, which was the only reason she had chosen it. His letter had said, "Miss Ford, I run a cattle operation 12 miles south of Caldwell. I need someone who can manage the house and cook for a crew of 7, including myself. I am not looking for decoration. I am looking for someone capable. Wages are $12 a month, room provided. If this suits you, write back. Warren Ellsworth, Ellsworth Ranch, Sumner County, Kansas." It had suited her fine. She had written back. And now here she was, squinting against the bright spring sun on the main street of Caldwell, which smelled powerfully of cattle and dust, and something she could not quite identify but suspected was a combination of leather oil and horse manure, while the stagecoach driver heaved her trunk down onto the boardwalk beside her. She was not, as she had plainly stated in her letter, a woman given to fancies. She wore a gray wool traveling dress that had been let out twice and taken in once in the years since she had first made it. Her brown hair was pinned up sensibly under a bonnet that had seen better days. Her eyes were a common brown, her complexion was unremarkable, and her hands were already rough from years of housework. She had always known, plain. Not ugly, just plain in the way that a good iron skillet is plain, functional, and unadorned and useful. She spotted the man she assumed was Warren Ellsworth before he spotted her, because he was looking down the street in the wrong direction. He was leaning against a hitching post outside the general store, with the kind of easy patience of a man accustomed to waiting for things that moved slower than he did, whether that was cattle or weather or stagecoaches. He was tall, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his mid-30s she guessed, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a face that had been thoroughly weathered by a Kansas sun. He wore a plain working coat over a blue shirt, and his boots were well-made and well-worn, which told her something. Men who cared for their tools cared for their land. She picked up her traveling bag, left her trunk where it was, and walked over to him. "Mr. Ellsworth," she said. He turned, and his expression when he looked at her was one of straightforward appraisal, not the kind that embarrassed, but the kind that a farmer gives a piece of machinery he is considering purchasing. She found she did not mind it because she was doing the same thing to him. "Miss Ford," he said, and put out his hand. His handshake was firm without being performative. "You made good time." "The road was dry," she said. "My trunk is back there by the coach. I'll get it. Tom is bringing the wagon around." He nodded toward the trunk and added, "You travel light." "I travel with what I need," she said. Something flickered in his expression then, brief as a shadow crossing grass, and she could not have said precisely what it was. He nodded once, went and collected her trunk with the ease of a man who was accustomed to lifting heavy things, and by the time the wagon had come around to the front of the general store, he had loaded it and was helping her up onto the seat with a courtesy that was matter-of-fact rather than showy. The drive out to the ranch took the better part of an hour on a road that was more suggestion than fact. 2 ruts through the short grass prairie that stretched away in every direction under a sky so large and blue it made Dorothy feel, for just a moment, like she was standing at the bottom of an ocean. She had not expected the sky to be quite so much of it, out here. Cincinnati had sky, certainly, but it was a sky that knew its place, framed by buildings and trees. This sky out here had no sense of proportion at all. She kept her thoughts to herself and watched the land. Warren drove with the same economical patience with which he appeared to do everything, and he did not try to fill the silence with pleasantries which she appreciated. He told her what she needed to know. The bunkhouse held 6 hands. She would have the small bedroom off the kitchen in the main house. There were 2 milk cows, a kitchen garden that he had not had time to tend properly since the previous housekeeper had left in February. He expected breakfast on the table by 6, a noon meal brought out to the hands if they were working the far pasture, supper at 7. Sunday mornings were her own after 8 o'clock. "That's agreeable," she said. "The hands are decent men," he added, and she caught something in his tone, a note of reassurance that surprised her slightly. "Rafe's been cooking since February, and they're all looking forward to someone who actually knows what they're doing." "What happened to your previous housekeeper?" she asked. "Her daughter in Missouri took ill," he said. "She went back to help. It was the right thing to do." Dorothy nodded. She asked no more questions. The land rolled by, and the wind moved through the grass in long, slow waves that reminded her of water, and somewhere overhead a meadowlark was singing its ridiculous, extravagant song, and she thought that this was not, all things considered, a terrible place to be. They came over a gentle rise, and the ranch spread out below them in the shallow valley, and it was larger than she had imagined. The main house was a 2-story frame building painted white, with a porch across the front. There was a big barn, red with a good roof, and a bunkhouse, and what appeared to be a separate small building that might have been a smokehouse or a wash house. The corral held half a dozen horses. The kitchen garden, visible behind the main house, was indeed a sorry state of weeds and winter detritus. "It's a good property," she said, because it was, and she believed in saying true things plainly. Warren glanced at her sideways. "Thank you," he said, and there was something genuine in it, like a man who had worked very hard for something and was not accustomed to hearing it acknowledged. They pulled into the yard, and the ranch hands came out to have a look, because of course they did. Men who live in close company with other men, and eat the same bad cooking for 2 months, are not indifferent to the arrival of someone who might improve their circumstances. They were respectful enough, standing in a rough line near the bunkhouse door, and Warren introduced them. There was Rafe Munoz, the oldest of the bunch and the one who had been doing the cooking, a compact, wiry Mexican man of around 40 with an expression of deep and sincere relief at her arrival. There was Pete Drummond, red-headed and freckled, no more than 20, who looked at his boots when introduced. There was Big Charlie Hess, who was indeed very large and looked like he could stop a wagon by sitting in front of it, and his younger brother Ned Hess, who was lean where Charlie was wide. There was a quiet Cheyenne man named Henry Walks Farr, who had been with the ranch for 3 years according to Warren's later explanation, and there was Calhoun Briggs, a Texan who spoke with an accent so thick it was almost geological. Dorothy looked at each of them steadily and said, "Gentlemen, I will have a proper supper on the table by 7 this evening. I would appreciate someone showing me where everything is kept." Rafe Munoz almost wept. Warren showed her the kitchen himself, walking her through the pantry, the root cellar, the pump outside the back door, the wood stack. The kitchen was in reasonable order, just lacking in ambition, the way all kitchens get when nobody who genuinely cares about cooking has been in them for a while. Dorothy assessed it quickly, made a mental list of what she would need from town, and set to work. By 7 o'clock that evening, she had produced a pot of beef stew with dumplings, a skillet of cornbread, a pot of beans, and an apple cake from the dried apples in the cellar. The hands ate with the focused silence of very hungry men who have been presented with something genuinely good, and the sounds around that table were the sounds of serious engagement with food rather than mere consumption. Warren ate across the table from her at the head of the long kitchen table, and she noticed that he ate everything on his plate and then looked at the pot on the stove with an expression she recognized as a man deciding whether it would be appropriate to ask for more. She ladled him another bowl without being asked. He looked at her with an expression she could not quite categorize, something warm and slightly startled, and said, "Thank you, Miss Ford. "You all look like you haven't eaten properly in weeks," she said. "There's more cake." There was, in that moment, a collective exhale around the table that was almost comical in its relief. That was Dorothy's first evening at the Ellsworth ranch. She was up before 5 the next morning to start the kitchen fire and get the oatmeal going, and when she opened the back door to get wood from the stack she found Warren already there, splitting logs in the gray pre-dawn light, and he looked up at her with an expression that was almost sheepish. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "There's coffee in about 10 minutes, she told him. He nodded, split one more log, and came inside. They sat at opposite ends of the kitchen table in the blue quiet of early morning, and Dorothy drank her coffee and Warren drank his, and neither of them said much, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who are accustomed to being up before the world and have learned to respect that hour. "The garden wants attention," she said at length. "I know," he said. "I haven't had time. I'll start on it today after breakfast. The frost is past." She paused. "You have seed." "In the barn, bottom shelf on the left side behind the oat barrels." She nodded. He drank his coffee. Outside the window, the sky began to shift from gray to a pale washed gold, and the meadowlark started up again with its improbable song. "Do you always wake this early?" he asked. "Always," she said. "So do I," he said, as if this surprised him in some way that he was not sure how to account for. The days settled into a rhythm that Dorothy found deeply satisfying in the way that useful work is satisfying, in the bones and not just the mind. She cleaned the house from top to bottom in the first week, got the kitchen garden planted, organized the pantry, mended the curtains in the main room that had been slowly unraveling along the seams, and established a cooking schedule that meant the hands always had something warm and decent to eat. She sent a list to town with Pete Drummond on his Saturday supply run, detailing what she needed, and when he returned with the wagon she inspected each item with the concentration of a general reviewing troops. The ranch hands were, as Warren had said, decent men. They were respectful, they thanked her for the food, they did not track mud through the kitchen more than could be expected of working men, and after the first week they began to treat her with the easy warmth of men who have decided that a person has earned their regard. Rafe Munoz was her particular ally. He knew the ranch's routines and the land's rhythms, and he explained things to her without condescension, standing at the corral fence and pointing out which pastures were which, and where the creek ran, and why the south field was kept for hay rather than grazing. Henry Walks Far said little to anyone, but on her 5th morning at the ranch she found a bunch of prairie wildflowers on the kitchen windowsill, left without ceremony or attribution, and when she looked out the window she saw him walking toward the barn with the careful, unhurried gait of a man who has not done anything in particular. She put the flowers in a mason jar on the kitchen table. Warren saw them when he came in for breakfast and raised an eyebrow but said nothing. It was Rafe who mentioned it to her, 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, leaning against the corral fence while she hung laundry on the line nearby. He said it casually, the way a man says a thing he has been thinking about for a while and has finally decided she ought to know. "You know, Miss Ford," he said, looking out at the horses in the corral, "that man there has not stopped smiling since you arrived." Dorothy paused in her hanging of a large kitchen cloth. "Is that so?" she said, because she was not the sort of woman who encouraged gossip. "I worked for him 6 years, Rafe said. He is a serious man. He smiles at good work and good weather and not much else, but since you came—" He shrugged, which was a gesture that communicated rather a lot without committing to any of it. "Big Charlie noticed it too, and Pete. Pete told Ned, and Ned told Calhoun, and Calhoun told Big Charlie that he had noticed it before Ned told him, which made Big Charlie very annoyed." Dorothy said nothing. She picked up another cloth and pinned it carefully to the line. "I am only telling you," Rafe said, "because you seem like a woman who prefers to know things." "Thank you, Rafe," she said, which ended that conversation. But she thought about it. She was not a woman who deceived herself about her own observations, and she had, in fact, noticed. She had noticed the way Warren looked at her sometimes, quick and then quickly away, the way a man looks at something he is trying not to be caught looking at. She had noticed the way he seemed to find reasons to be in the kitchen in the early mornings, which she had come to think of as their particular shared hour. She had noticed that he always said thank you at the end of a meal, and that when he said it to her, it was slightly different from when he said it as a general remark to the table, a shade more deliberate, a shade more personal. She told herself not to build anything out of these observations. She was the housekeeper. She was practical and plain, and she was here to cook and clean and tend the garden, and men who owned ranches did not develop romantic interests in their housekeepers, or if they did, it was generally a situation that ended badly for the housekeeper. She had seen it happen to other women twice. She had no intention of being foolish. She told herself all of this very sensibly on a warm May evening while she was sitting on the back porch shelling peas. And then Warren came around the corner of the house with his hat in his hand, as if he had taken it off on purpose before approaching her, and said, "Miss Ford, I wonder if you might want to see something." She looked at him. He looked somewhat as if he had rehearsed this and then forgotten what came after the first sentence. "What sort of something?" she asked. "There are horses," he said, "out on the South Rise, mustangs. They come through this time of year. I thought if you hadn't seen them before." He stopped. "I just thought you might like to see them," he finished, which was less polished than whatever he had rehearsed but considerably more genuine. She set down her peas and stood up. They walked out through the kitchen garden and past the far edge of the corral and up the long, gentle slope of the south pasture in the orange light of early evening. And they did not say much, just walked together at an easy pace. And Dorothy was aware with a clarity that she found somewhat inconvenient that she was comfortable in this silence in a way she had not been comfortable anywhere in a very long time. Not since before James died, maybe. Not since before the illness took him, and she had spent the better part of 2 years managing a grief that sat on her chest like a stone. She had not thought about James in a week, she realized. Not a single thought. They came to the rise, and there below them in the last warm light was a band of mustangs, maybe 30 of them, moving in the slow rolling way of horses that are going somewhere, but are in no particular hurry, their colors running from bay to black to a pale cream that caught the sunset like copper. They were magnificent and ridiculous and wild in a way that made Dorothy's chest ache with something she could not name precisely. "Oh," she said, which was not a very articulate response, but it was an honest one. Warren was standing beside her about 2 feet away, and he was watching her rather than the horses, and she knew it, and she did not look at him. "They come through every May," he said. "Same band. I've seen this one for 4 years. The Palomino at the front, she's the lead mare." "She's beautiful," Dorothy said. "She is," Warren said, and he still was not looking at the mare. Dorothy turned and looked at him directly, the way she did most things, without evasion or coy pretense, and he met her eyes with an expression that was entirely unguarded, which was apparently what happened when Warren Ellsworth forgot to manage himself, and it was quite startling to see on the face of a man who was otherwise so carefully composed. "Mr. Ellsworth," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think you should know," she said, "that I am not good at being indirect about things. I find it wastes time and creates confusion." "I appreciate that," he said carefully. "So," she said, and stopped because she was not, despite her stated preference, entirely sure how to be direct about this particular thing. "So," he said, and he was smiling now, and she could see what Rafe had been talking about. It was the kind of smile that changed a man's whole face, made him look younger and warmer and somehow less like a rancher and more like a person. "I have been trying to think of a reasonable way to ask if you might walk with me on Sunday morning after 8. Not as employer and employee. Just walking." Dorothy considered this. The mustangs moved below them, the Palomino mare leading her band through the golden grass, going wherever wild things go. "I expect that would be agreeable," she said. The smile got wider. She looked back at the horses before she did something undignified. She had been telling herself for 3 weeks that she was plain and practical, and that this was not the sort of story that happened to plain and practical women. But looking at the Mustangs moving through the sunset light with a man who had apparently not stopped smiling since her arrival standing 2 feet away, she began to wonder, in the most cautious and sensible way possible, whether she had perhaps been wrong about that. Their Sunday morning walks became the thing that Dorothy found herself looking forward to during the week, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge it, even if she was not yet ready to examine too closely what that meant. They would set out after breakfast, just the two of them, while the hands did their own quiet Sunday things, Pete writing letters home to Ohio and Big Charlie sleeping, and Calhoun repairing tack with the careful concentration of a man who had very little patience for anything but things he understood. Henry Walks Far was sometimes simply gone on Sunday mornings, coming back in the afternoon with a quiet air of having been somewhere necessary, and Dorothy did not ask, and Warren did not explain. On their first Sunday walk, they went down to the creek, and Warren showed her where the cottonwoods grew thick along the bank, and a family of red foxes had their den in the roots of the biggest one. On the second Sunday, they went north to the highest point of the property, a long flat-topped ridge from which you could see so far in every direction that the horizon seemed genuinely curved, and Warren pointed out where his property ended and the neighboring Whitmore operation began, and told her about the history of the land, how his father had come out from Ohio in 1864 and bought the original 500 acres for almost nothing because nobody thought grassland was worth anything, and how Warren had spent 15 years building it up to its current 2,000 acres. "You love it," Dorothy said, standing on the ridge with the wind moving her hair loose from its pins, and she was not asking. "More than most things," he said, which was careful but also honest, and she valued honesty above almost everything. On the third Sunday, he asked her about Cincinnati, and she told him about her 7 years of marriage to James Ford, who had been a printer and a kind man who died of a fever in the winter of 1879, leaving her the house and a small amount of money that had kept her respectably for 2 years before she had admitted to herself that she needed to do something more purposeful than survive. She told it plainly without excessive grief because she had done most of her grieving already and she did not believe in performing emotion for an audience. Warren listened with full attention, and when she finished he said, "I'm sorry you lost him." "Thank you," she said. "He was a good man. I was lucky to have him." There was a pause, and then Warren said, "I was engaged once, 8 years ago. She decided that a working ranch in Kansas was not what she wanted. I think she was right, actually. She would have been miserable here. What happened to her?" "She married a banker in St. Louis," he said. "I heard she's happy. I'm glad of it." Dorothy looked at him. "You don't say that as a man who is still carrying a wound," she said. "No," he agreed. "I think I was more in love with the idea of having someone than I was with her particularly. That's not a kind thing to say about a person, but it's honest." "It is," she said, and she appreciated the honesty very much. On the fourth Sunday walk it rained, which meant they sat on the covered porch instead, with coffee, watching the rain move across the grassland in great gray curtains, and they talked about books. Warren had a considerable shelf of them in his study, more than Dorothy had expected, and he was a man who had read widely if not always conventionally, Dickens and Hart and Twain, and some volumes of natural history that he had gotten from a university catalog in Lawrence. Dorothy had brought 3 books in her trunk, and they discussed them with the particular pleasure of two people who have found an unexpected shared territory. At some point during the rain, Dorothy became aware that they had stopped, leaving 2 feet of careful distance between them on the porch bench, and were now sitting perhaps 6 inches apart, close enough that his arm occasionally brushed hers when he gestured, and neither of them had remarked upon it or moved away. The rain smelled like green things and wet earth, and inside the house she could hear the distant sound of Calhoun playing a harmonica with more enthusiasm than skill, and she thought, "This is a good life. This is a genuinely good life." She had not let herself think that in a long time. June came in with heat and the full riot of the growing season, and the ranch was in the particular busy intensity of early summer, cattle out on the grass, the garden producing its first results, the hay fields coming up thick. Dorothy expanded her kitchen operations to meet the energy of the season, making fresh bread every other day, putting up the first of the vegetables in the cellar, learning from Rafe which herbs grew wild on the creek bank and could be added to the stew pot. It was Rafe who, one afternoon while she was hoeing the garden and he was mending a section of fence nearby, said with the same offhand air he had used before, "You know, Miss Ford, I think the boss is going to say something to you soon." Dorothy kept hoeing. "Say what?" she asked, though she knew. "He spent 45 minutes last night looking at that shelf of books and he was not reading any of them," Rafe said. "He was just standing there." When a man who works as hard as that man does just stands and stares at books for 45 minutes, it means his mind is somewhere entirely different. "Rafe," she said, "don't you have fence to mend?" "I do," he said cheerfully and returned to his fence. Dorothy stopped hoeing for a moment and looked out at the open prairie beyond the garden fence, and she allowed herself, just briefly, to want what she thought was building between them. It was a thing she had not done yet, the wanting, because she had been protecting herself against it, and she was aware of how much she had been protecting herself, and she was aware that the protection was starting to feel more like a cage than a shield. She was plain. She was practical. She was 28 years old and she had already loved one good man and buried him, and she was not afraid of love, but she was afraid of loss, which was not quite the same thing but lived in the same neighborhood of the heart. She picked up her hoe again and finished the row. It was a Thursday evening, 2 weeks into June, when things shifted. The supper dishes had been washed and put away, and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and Dorothy was sitting at the kitchen table writing her weekly grocery list in her small, careful handwriting, and Warren came back inside after his nightly check of the barn. He poured himself a last cup of coffee from the pot, which was his habit, and then instead of taking it to his study as he usually did, he sat down across from her. She kept writing for a moment, finishing her sentence, then looked up. He was looking at his coffee cup, turning it in his hands in a way that suggested he was working up to something, and she watched him with patience because she was a patient woman when patience was called for. "Miss Ford," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked up. "Dorothy," he said, which was the first time he had used her given name, and it landed between them with a weight that was impossible to ignore. "I want to say something to you, and I want to say it properly, and I've been trying to figure out how to do that for about a month, and I've decided that I am better at plain speaking than at anything else, so I'm just going to say it plainly." "I would prefer that," she said. "I am not a man who does things lightly," he said. "I don't say things I don't mean, and I don't start things I don't intend to see through. So when I tell you that you are the most remarkable woman I have ever had the privilege of knowing, I want you to understand that I have thought about that statement very carefully, and I mean every word of it." Dorothy put down her pencil. "I know what I am," he continued, with the careful, steady delivery of a man who has rehearsed this, and this time is not forgetting what came after the first sentence. "I am a rancher in Kansas. I am 35 years old. I am not particularly interesting to look at, and my land is beautiful, but the life here is hard, and I spend most of my year covered in dirt and sweat. I know that you came here as my employee, and I know that changes the nature of what I am saying, and if you would prefer that nothing changes, I will respect that entirely. But I would not be honest if I did not tell you that I have thought about you every morning when I wake up and every evening when I go to bed, and every hour in between since about the third day you were here." Dorothy sat with this for a moment. The lamp on the table was warm between them, and outside the June insects were singing their urgent summer songs. "Warren," she said, using his name deliberately in turn, watching his expression do something quick and unguarded, "I told you the first week that I prefer directness." "You did," he said. "So let me be direct," she said. "I came here to work. I am the housekeeper. I am not a woman who expected." She stopped, reorganized. I am plain and practical, and I have always known it, and I have never minded it, because I think there is a great deal more to life than whether a woman is decorative. But I want you to be sure that you are not." She stopped again. This was harder than she had expected. "I want you to be sure that you are not confusing gratitude for good cooking with something else." Warren looked at her with an expression of such transparent sincerity that it nearly undid her. "Dorothy," he said, "I have eaten excellent cooking before. It does not generally make me feel like I have been standing in a field in the rain and suddenly found shelter." He paused. "I don't know that I explained that metaphor correctly." "You explained it well enough," she said, and she could feel the smile starting at the corner of her mouth, and she did not entirely suppress it. "I am not proposing anything tonight," he said, and the word proposing landed with its obvious implications, which he had clearly meant. "I am only telling you where I stand, because you are a woman who prefers to know things." "Rafe told you that," she said. "Rafe tells me a great many things," Warren said, and he was smiling now, the real smile, the one that changed his whole face, and she thought, "There it is. That is the smile Rafe was talking about. Most of them I could have worked out for myself." Dorothy picked up her pencil again, not because she intended to go on writing, but because she needed something to do with her hands. "I think," she said carefully, "that if you want to know where I stand, you should ask me on Sunday morning, after we have walked." He nodded. He stood up, took his coffee, and went toward the door to the hallway, and then he stopped and turned back. "Thank you," he said, and it was the same thank you he said at the end of every meal, except that this time it was not about the meal at all. She looked at the grocery list after he left, and realized she had written the word flour 3 times. Sunday came after a week that felt significantly longer than 7 days. Dorothy was aware that she was aware of it, which irritated her in a mild and fond way, as if some part of herself that she had kept very quiet for 3 years had decided to wake up and make itself known. She caught herself, on Friday evening, standing at the kitchen window after supper looking out at the evening sky, and she could not have said what she was looking at exactly, only that it was turning extraordinary colors over the prairie, orange and rose, and a deep burning gold at the horizon, and she was feeling something that she recognized distantly as happiness. She was not accustomed to recognizing it quite so easily. It had been a while. Sunday morning she was up at her usual time, made breakfast, fed the hands, and then at 8 o'clock she tied on her good bonnet, the slightly better one she had brought for Sundays, and went out to the porch, where Warren was already waiting with his hat in his hands again. He had shaved carefully, she noticed. They walked south toward the creek, and the morning was bright and cool, the dew still heavy on the grass, and a lark was singing from somewhere in the blue sky above them. They were quiet for a while, which was comfortable, and then they reached the cottonwood trees along the creek and stood in the dappled shade while the water moved clear and quick over its limestone bed. "I have been thinking," Dorothy said, "about what you told me Thursday." "I thought you might have been," he said. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want to tell it accurately." She looked at the water rather than at him because this was easier. "When I came here, I had a very clear picture of what my life was going to be. Useful, purposeful, respectable. I was going to work hard and do good work, and that was going to be sufficient. And for a long time I thought that was the honest truth about what I needed." She paused. "I had not accounted for morning coffee," she said. He turned his head toward her. "For morning coffee," he repeated. "Those hours in the kitchen before the world is up," she said. "And Sunday mornings, and mustangs at sunset, and books on a rainy porch." She finally looked at him. "I had not accounted for any of that, and I find that I am not actually as purely practical as I believed I was." The expression on Warren Ellsworth's face in that moment was something Dorothy thought she would remember for the rest of her life. It was not triumph or relief exactly, though it was both of those things too. It was primarily the expression of a man seeing something that he had hoped was there but had not been entirely certain was, and finding that it is, finding that the thing is real and solid and right there in front of him, and the morning light was in his eyes, and the creek was running over its stones, and everything was very still. "Dorothy," he said. "I am still plain and practical," she said. "That is not going to change." "I know," he said. "I would not want it to." "And I will not pretend to be otherwise," she said. "I am not a woman who does that." "I know that too," he said. "All right," she said. "All right," he said, and he reached out and took her hand, just that, held it with a care that was also a kind of declaration. And they stood by the creek for a long while in the June morning with the water talking over the stones below them. And Dorothy thought that it was remarkable, really, how a person could think they knew the exact shape of their own life and be entirely wrong about it. And somehow that wrongness could turn out to be the best thing imaginable. It was Rafe, naturally, who told the other hands. He did not make a production of it. He simply mentioned at supper that Monday evening, with the same offhand air that was clearly entirely deliberate, that he thought things were going to change around the Ellsworth ranch in the near future, and he meant that as a good thing. Big Charlie looked at Pete, who looked at Ned, who looked at Calhoun, who looked at Henry, who looked at nobody but turned the corners of his mouth up very slightly in what was, for Henry walks far, essentially the equivalent of a standing ovation. Dorothy, who was ladling out the stew and had heard all of this, said, "Rafe, if you have things to say them plainly." Rafe said, perfectly pleasantly, "I said them plainly, Miss Ford." There was a sound from the head of the table that was Warren attempting to suppress a laugh and not entirely succeeding. The weeks that followed were the most extraordinary ordinary weeks that Dorothy could remember experiencing. The work of the ranch went on as it always had, the cattle and the garden and the cooking and the endless maintenance of a large working property. But underneath all of it there was this new current, warm and steady, the knowledge that she and Warren were building something together that was more than employer and employee. He was careful and deliberate about it, which suited her. He courted her the way he apparently did everything, with patience and attention to detail, and without hurrying anything. He brought her a book from Caldwell on one of his supply runs, a volume of natural history she had mentioned she had not read. She left an extra slice of apple cake at his place at the table without comment. He fixed the loose board on her bedroom windowsill that she had not mentioned to him, which meant he had noticed it when she had not told him about it. She darned the elbow of his good coat without being asked, and left it folded on the kitchen chair he always took. These small attentions accumulated in the way that real things do, quietly and without announcement, and the ranch hands watched all of it with the collective satisfaction of men who are witnessing something good happening to people they like. In July, there was a difficulty. It was not romantic in nature. It was the practical, pressing kind of difficulty that the frontier produced with democratic regularity for anyone who lived on it. A stretch of very dry weeks in late June had left the creek lower than usual, and a dispute arose with the neighboring Whitmore operation about water rights on the north section, where both properties drew from the same tributary. Nathan Whitmore was not a bad man, but he was a worried man that summer, with his herd larger than his water supply, and worry made men hard. There were several sharp exchanges between his hands and Warren's at the shared fence line, and Calhoun came back from the north pasture one afternoon with a bruised jaw and a story that Warren listened to with the careful stillness of a man controlling his temper. Dorothy watched Warren handle this with an attention she was only partly aware she was paying. She watched him ride out to the Whitmore property himself, alone, without taking any of the hands, and she watched him come back 2 hours later with an expression that was tired but settled. He had worked out an arrangement with Nathan Whitmore about shared access that was fair to both operations, and he had managed it without violence, which Calhoun had been in favor of and which Warren had been decidedly against. "It was not worth someone getting shot over," Warren said at supper that evening matter-of-factly. "It never is," Dorothy said. After supper, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, she brought him a second cup of coffee in the kitchen and sat down across from him while he looked out the window at the dark yard, and she said, "You did a right thing today." He looked at her. "I may have done a practical thing," he said. I am not sure it was a generous one. Whitmore's herd is suffering. You gave him fair access to the water, she said. That was generous. His family needs it, Warren said simply, as if this were obvious, and she supposed to him it was. Dorothy looked at this man across the kitchen table, this careful and principled and unsentimental man who split wood before sunrise and made fair water agreements with difficult neighbors, and who had apparently not stopped smiling since she arrived. And she thought, I am going to marry this man if he asks me, and I am going to say yes without any of the wavering and self-protective hesitation that I have been practicing. She decided this with the same practical certainty with which she decided things like how many jars of tomatoes to put up for winter, and she found it very freeing. It was Henry Walks Far who told her something she had not known, one afternoon in late July while she was picking the first of the summer squash, and he was doing something quiet and purposeful with a length of rope nearby. He spoke in the direct way he had on the rare occasions when he spoke, without preamble or social decoration. This land remembers the Cheyenne, he said, looking at the prairie beyond the garden fence. My people were here for more years than this country has been a country. Dorothy straightened and looked at him. I know, she said. Ellsworth knows it too, Henry said. He treats me like a man, not all ranchers do. He looked at her. He is a good man, unusual good man. I know that too, Dorothy said. Henry nodded once as if they had reached an agreement and went back to his rope. Dorothy stood in the kitchen garden with the sun on her shoulders and thought about what it meant to find a good person in the world, and to recognize them for what they were, and to have the courage to not waste the finding. Warren Ellsworth was not a man given to grand gestures, which was one of the things she respected about him. So she was not entirely surprised when he proposed to her on an ordinary August Tuesday evening, while they were both sitting on the back porch watching the lightning from a distant storm walk across the dark horizon in white gold flashes. There was no kneeling, no elaborate speech, no orchestrated moment. He simply turned to her, held out the small ring he had been carrying in his coat pocket for the better part of a month. She knew this because Rafe had mentioned it with the satisfied air of a man reporting something he had been waiting to report, and said, Dorothy, I would like very much to spend the rest of my life with you, if you will allow me that. I think you know who I am by now. I think you know what the life here looks like. I am not going to promise you anything except that I will be honest with you and work as hard as I can and try to be worthy of your company. The lightning flickered on the distant horizon and the night smelled of coming rain, and Dorothy Ford, who was plain and practical and had never expected anything so extravagant as this, looked at this man she had come to love with a thoroughness that surprised her daily, and said, Yes, Warren, that is exactly what I want. He put the ring on her finger. It fit perfectly, which she thought later was not a coincidence, was probably the result of some careful observation on his part and possibly a conversation with Rafe, who missed very little. They sat on the porch for a long while after that, watching the storm, and he held her hand, and the first drops of rain began to touch the dry earth, and Dorothy thought that this was about as close to perfect as a Tuesday evening was likely to get. The hands knew by breakfast Wednesday morning, which meant they had known by Tuesday evening, which meant Warren had told at least one of them before he came to the porch, which she found, when she thought about it, deeply endearing. Rafe shook her hand with great formality and considerable emotion. Big Charlie appeared to be moved beyond speech, which for Big Charlie was notable. Pete was delighted and immediately wanted to know when the wedding would be. Calhoun said in his extraordinary accent that it was the best news he had heard since the Longhorns beat the Winter, which she assumed was a compliment, though she was not entirely sure about the reference. Henry Walks Far looked at her with his quiet eyes and said simply, Good, which she understood meant a great deal. They were married in September in Caldwell at the small Methodist church, on a Saturday that was warm and golden in the way that Kansas September days can be, as if the summer is offering one more generous gift before it surrenders to autumn. Dorothy wore her best dress, blue wool, which she had trimmed with white lace that had been her mother's. Warren wore a new suit that Rafe had apparently been instrumental in persuading him to purchase, the entire ranch hand contingent having strong opinions on the matter. The hands attended in a row, cleaned up and self-conscious and visibly pleased with themselves, and Rafe cried, which he did not acknowledge and which everyone else very carefully did not mention. Henry Walks Far stood in the back of the church in his best clothes and watched with an expression of such private satisfaction that Dorothy, catching sight of him over Warren's shoulder during the ceremony, felt something warm rush through her chest. The minister was a thin, earnest young man from Ohio who conducted the ceremony with genuine feeling and only one wrong word, which he corrected immediately. And Warren said his vows in the steady, deliberate way he did everything, looking at Dorothy as if she were the only thing in the room worth looking at, and Dorothy said hers clearly and without tremor, because she meant them entirely. Afterward they had a supper at the hotel dining room, the hands and 3 of the neighboring ranch families, and Calhoun played the harmonica with somewhat more skill than he usually demonstrated, and Pete danced with the Whitmore family's daughter, who was 17 and very pleased about it, and Big Charlie ate heroic quantities and was content. Nathan Whitmore shook Warren's hand with genuine warmth, the water dispute having been resolved to both their satisfaction through the summer, and his wife pressed Dorothy's hand and said that it was wonderful to have another woman with sense in the county. Warren and Dorothy drove home to the ranch in the wagon under a sky full of September stars, and the prairie smelled of dry grass and distance, and she leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they drove in the good silence of 2 people who are exactly where they want to be. The autumn that followed was one of the happiest periods of Dorothy's life, which was a thing she could not have predicted from the vantage point of that Tuesday morning when she stepped off the stagecoach with her battered trunk and her sewing kit. She had been expecting a position. She had found a home. She moved her few things from the housekeeper's room into the main bedroom, which Warren had painted in August, the kind of thoughtful preparation that she had noticed and not commented on at the time. They rearranged the furniture together on a Sunday afternoon, Dorothy directing and Warren lifting, with occasional input from Pete, who appeared in the doorway at an opportune moment and was promptly given one end of the wardrobe to carry. Married life suited them both in the particular way that it suits people who are already naturally compatible and have had the good sense to admit it. They continued their early morning kitchen hours. They continued their Sunday walks. Dorothy continued running the house with the same purposeful efficiency, but now it was explicitly her house as well, and this distinction mattered to her in a way she had not anticipated, a sense of rootedness, of having planted herself in the earth of this place. She found things she had not known she was looking for. She found the specific texture of Warren's laugh, which happened rarely and therefore mattered. She found that he was a man who read before bed and sometimes read aloud to her without being asked, choosing passages that he thought she would like with a reliability that was touching. She found that he trusted her judgment on the ranch business and would bring her problems and listen to her thinking the way he listened to Rafe, which was the highest compliment she could have been paid. He consulted her when he was considering buying additional pasture land in October, and she worked through the numbers with him at the kitchen table, and her analysis helped him decide to wait until spring, which proved to be correct when the land came available at a better price in April. She found also that she worried about him. This was a new experience. She had worried about James, but James had been a gentle man in a safe trade, and her worries about him had been the ordinary ones. Worry about Warren was different in its texture, because he worked in the particular casual danger of ranch work, with horses and cattle and rough country and men who sometimes made decisions under pressure that resulted in injury. She watched the hands come in with minor wounds and said nothing but thought about it, about how quickly things could change on a working ranch. One cold October morning, she heard shouting from the direction of the corral and went to the kitchen window to see a young horse that had apparently come loose doing something athletic and alarmed, while Warren and Calhoun worked to contain it. The horse was making a genuine effort to be somewhere else entirely, and Warren was handling it with the kind of total concentration that also means total absence of self-preservation instinct. And Dorothy stood at the kitchen window with her dish towel in her hands and felt her heart do something loud and objectionable against her ribs, until the situation was resolved, which it was, without incident, in about 10 minutes. She was stirring the porridge with unnecessary vigor when Warren came in afterward, brushing his coat off, and said, "Frisky this morning," with the offhand air of a man who does not understand what he just did to the nervous system of a person who loves him. "Sit down," she said. "Eat." He sat down and ate. She poured his coffee and set it in front of him rather more firmly than was strictly necessary. He looked at her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Perfectly," she said. He looked at her for another moment with that quality of attention he had and then said very quietly, "I was always careful. I'm more careful now." She looked at him. "Are you?" she said. "I have considerably more to be careful for," he said simply. She sat down across from him with her own coffee and they looked at each other, and she thought about what it was to love someone and have them love you back, and to live with the fact that the world was not always safe, and the best you could do was be careful and present and thankful for each morning. "Yes," she said, "you do." The winter of 1882 to 1883 was hard, as winters on the Kansas plains tended to be, with a series of blizzards in January that kept everyone close to the buildings for days at a stretch and required constant vigilance about the livestock. Dorothy found that the close quarters of a big snowbound ranch with 7 men and 1 woman were actually entirely manageable, because she had always understood that living in company with people required patience and a sense of humor and a willingness to sometimes ignore small irritations for the sake of the larger peace. She made bread every day during the blizzard weeks because the hands needed something to do with their noses, and the smell of bread being made is one of the more effective remedies for cabin fever that has ever been discovered. She taught Pete to play checkers properly. He had been playing an idiosyncratic version that bore little resemblance to the actual game. She mended everything that needed mending and made a rag rug for the kitchen floor from scraps she had been collecting since August. She read in the evenings by the fire, and Warren read beside her, and the lamp was warm, and the wind was extraordinary outside the windows, and the house was full of the good sounds of people managing. It was in February, a week after the last blizzard had moved on and the world was white and painfully bright under a clear blue sky, that Dorothy confirmed what she had suspected for about 3 weeks. She did not tell Warren immediately. She sat with the knowledge for 1 day, just 1 day, and let herself feel the extraordinary weight of it, the way it rearranged everything in her understanding of the future. She had been pregnant before, once with James, very early in their marriage, and had lost the baby before the 4th month. She had not spoken of it to Warren, and she thought about whether this was a thing he needed to know and decided it was, because she wanted him to understand that she knew this could go in different directions, and she did not intend to pretend otherwise. She told him on a Sunday morning. They were in the kitchen, just the 2 of them in the early quiet, and she said, "I have something to tell you," and then she told him. The expression on Warren Ellsworth's face in that moment was unlike anything she had seen on him before. It was a man trying very hard to be composed and simultaneously losing that effort completely, and then giving up on the composure and just feeling the thing fully, which in his case looked like a man who has been standing out in cold weather for a long time and has just come inside to a warm fire. His eyes went bright and he set down his coffee cup and he reached across the table and took both her hands. "Dorothy," he said. "I also want to tell you," she said carefully, "that I lost a child before, with James, early. I'm telling you because I don't want to pretend that I don't know it might. I know, he said. I know that it might. We will be as careful as a person can be, and beyond that we will trust. He held her hands and looked at her with an expression of such complete love and such steady courage that she felt the thing in her chest that had been tight with the telling begin to loosen. Whatever happens, he said, I am with you. She nodded, she believed him. She told Rafe, because Rafe was going to figure it out within the week anyway, and she preferred to tell him rather than be told by him that he had noticed. Rafe received the news with the air of a man whose world has been organized correctly at last, and promised with great sincerity to personally supervise the reduction of any heavy lifting in her vicinity, a promise which she allowed him to believe he was going to be able to keep, because it made him happy. The spring of 1883 arrived in the way it always arrived on the plains, with a sudden extravagance of green after the long brown and white of winter, the grass coming up thick and the creek running full, and the mustangs appearing again on the south rise in early May. Warren took her out to see them again, as he had on that first evening, and they stood on the rise together, and the Palomino mare was at the front of her band as she always was, going somewhere with purpose and authority, and Dorothy stood against Warren's side with his arm around her and the May wind moving through the grass. Same mare, she said. Every year, he said. She was showing by then, visibly, in the way she had started to show in March, and everything about the pregnancy had been, so far, healthy and normal, and she was allowing herself to be hopeful in the cautious, practical way that was the only kind of hope she knew. The ranch doctor who came out from Caldwell every 2 months had said in April that she was well, and the baby was well, and she should continue exactly as she was. She had continued exactly as she was, which in practice meant she had continued running the household with the same efficiency while delegating the heavy work to the hands, who competed for the privilege with a devotion that was entirely genuine and faintly comical. Rafe supervised her kitchen activities with barely disguised anxiety. Big Charlie had appointed himself guardian of the back steps and had reinforced them with additional timber in February as a precautionary measure. Pete had made a small wooden stool for the kitchen counter so she did not have to reach. Henry Walks Far had, without comment, taken over all the pump maintenance so she never had to use force on the stiff handle. She thought often about what it meant to be received into a community of people who genuinely cared about her well-being, not as obligation, but as something freely offered and freely felt. She had come here as a stranger with a battered trunk and an honest advertisement, and she had been given a home and a family and a life she had not imagined, and she thought that it was important to know when you had been given something extraordinary and to be grateful for it. Warren had bought the additional pasture land in April, the land they had looked at in October, at the better spring price she had predicted, and he had shown her the deed with a satisfaction that was partly about the land and partly about the accuracy of her judgment, and she had looked at the deed and thought that it had her name on it too now, as his wife, and the weight of that was something she was still learning to carry in the best possible way. Warren Ellsworth's son was born in late July of 1883, on a hot Tuesday morning, delivered by the Caldwell doctor and attended by Mrs. Nathan Whitmore, who turned out to be a sensible woman of considerable experience and who kept Warren from wearing a path in the kitchen floorboards with a combination of firm instruction and strong coffee. The baby was healthy. Dorothy was well. The delivery had been difficult in its last hours, genuinely difficult in the way that Warren stood outside the bedroom door listening to sounds that were the hardest sounds he had ever heard, and felt entirely helpless for the first time since he had taken over his father's ranch at 19, and when the doctor finally opened the door and said, "A boy." Both of them fine. Warren Ellsworth sat down in the hallway chair and put his face in his hands and breathed. He was allowed in after a while. Dorothy was propped against the pillows looking exhausted and composed in the particular way that she looked composed when she was working at it, and the baby was in her arms, and she looked up when Warren came in and said, "Come and meet your son." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, who was extraordinarily small and appeared very certain about being here, and who had Dorothy's brown eyes and what Warren suspected might be his own obstinate chin, and he said, "He's remarkable." "He is," Dorothy agreed, with the pleased certainty of a woman stating a fact. "What do you want to name him?" Warren asked. She had thought about this. "Thomas," she said, "for your father if that suits you." Warren looked at her. Thomas Ellsworth had died in 1876, and Warren had buried him on the North Rise and visited the grave on Sunday mornings sometimes, and Dorothy had known this without being told and had apparently been holding this name for the right moment. "That suits me very well," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady, which she did not comment on, for which he was grateful. Thomas Ellsworth was a decisive and healthy baby who had strong opinions about feeding schedules and made them known with impressive volume. The ranch hands greeted his arrival with the collective delight of men who have been waiting for something to admire, and the baby was passed from hand to hand in the kitchen on his first full day home with the solemnity of men who have not held many babies and are very serious about doing it correctly. Big Charlie held him with the concentrated delicacy of a man handling something very precious and very breakable. Pete looked at the baby with the expression of a young man encountering something that makes him think ahead in a way he has not thought before. Rafe spoke to the baby in Spanish, quietly, which the baby appeared to find entirely satisfactory. Calhoun held him awkwardly but with great goodwill. Henry Walks Far held him last and looked at him for a long, quiet moment, and then looked at Dorothy and said, "He will know this land." "He will," Dorothy said. The months that followed settled into the particular fullness of life, with a new baby on a working ranch. Exhausting and loud and luminous in the way that things are when you are too tired to have any defenses left, and the beauty of small moments gets through directly. Dorothy nursed Thomas and managed the household, and eventually, by October, was back to her full range of activities, slightly different in tempo but essentially herself. And Warren was the kind of father she had suspected he would be, present and attentive and practical in his affection, reading to Thomas from very early on in the quiet evenings, walking with him in the early mornings when the baby was fussy and the rest of the house needed sleep. She watched this man with their son in the gray pre-dawn light and felt something so large and quiet in her chest that she had no name for it, only the steady certainty of it. The ranch prospered. The additional pasture from the spring purchase proved excellent, and the herd expanded, and the year's revenue was the best Warren had seen in 6 years. He paid the hands a bonus in December that made Calhoun briefly speechless and Pete visibly emotional, and he told Dorothy that it was in large part because of the household efficiencies she had implemented and the kitchen garden she had expanded, which reduced their supply costs substantially. And she said, "It is also because you work harder than anyone on this land," which was true, and he knew it, but she thought it was important to say. Christmas of 1883 was an extravagant affair by the standards of the Ellsworth Ranch, which meant there was a proper Christmas dinner with a turkey and 3 pies and a cake, and Rafe made tamales, which had become a firm tradition, and Pete played the harmonica because Calhoun had broken his in November and had not yet replaced it, and Thomas Ellsworth, aged approximately 5 months, presided over the occasion from a basket near the fire with the serene authority of a person who has not yet learned that he is not, in fact, the center of the universe. Henry Walks Far gave the baby a small carved figure, a horse with careful detail, that he had made over several weeks in the evenings, and Dorothy accepted it with a gravity that matched the gesture, and put it on the mantelpiece where Thomas would be able to see it as he grew. The new year came in cold and clear, and the plains were dark and the stars were extraordinary, and Dorothy stood on the porch in her coat with Warren beside her at midnight, just the two of them, the house quiet behind them, and the grassland extended in every direction under the dark sky, and it was hers, she thought. not just in the legal sense that the deed now carried her name. In the deeper sense, in the sense of a place that had received her and been made more by her presence in it, and in which she had been made more. She had arrived here with a battered trunk and the determination to be useful, and she had been given everything. "What are you thinking?" Warren asked. "I am thinking that I was entirely wrong about what my life was going to look like," she said. "Is that all right?" He asked with a quality of gentle attention that still, after more than a year of marriage, could catch her completely off guard. "It is the best kind of being wrong," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the January stars were very bright, and somewhere in the house Thomas made a small sound and then was quiet again, dreaming whatever 5-month-old boys dream. The years that followed were full in the way that good lives are full, not always easy, not always smooth, but rich with the specific texture of people living purposefully on land they love with people they have chosen. The ranch grew steadily. Warren bought the South pasture in 1885, giving them a total of 3,000 acres, and Dorothy ran the household accounts with the same precision she brought to everything. And they talked about the ranch as a shared enterprise, which it was, in every practical and emotional sense. Thomas Ellsworth grew into a boy of determined character, and Warren's stubborn chin and Dorothy's practical eyes, who walked before he should have, talked before anyone expected, and developed a passionate attachment to the horses at an age when other children were still primarily interested in whatever was nearest their hands. By his 3rd year, he was spending most of his waking hours near the corral, watching the horses with an intensity of attention that made Warren laugh and made Rafe shake his head in fond exasperation. Dorothy watched her son with her hands and was satisfied. She had not known she would be this kind of mother, the kind who was not anxious, who did not wrap the child in excessive concern, who let him fall down a reasonable number of times and get up again. She had not known until she was it. She thought it was probably because Warren was the kind of father he was, steady and present and trusting, and that had given her permission to trust as well. In 1885 she was pregnant again, and this time it was easier, perhaps because she was less afraid, perhaps because her body remembered more confidently. She told Warren on a Sunday morning, same as before, in their kitchen with their coffee, and this time he did not have to fight for composure, just looked at her with that wide, changed smile and said, "Good. You sound like Henry," she said. "Henry generally has it right," Warren said. Henry Walks Far was still at the ranch. He had come and gone a few times, returning to his people for seasons and then coming back, and Warren had always welcomed him without requiring explanation. He was teaching Thomas, with Dorothy's full support and Warren's active encouragement, some Cheyenne words, and the child collected them with delight, mixing them into his conversation in a way that made Rafe occasionally confused, and Henry Walks Far quietly pleased. Dorothy had a second child in March of 1886, a daughter, which surprised her only in the sense that she had been expecting another boy for no rational reason. The baby was dark-haired and had Warren's gray-green eyes and arrived into the world with an expression of someone who has been somewhere rather interesting and has opinions about it. And Dorothy looked at this small, fierce face and thought, "You are going to be considerable trouble, and I am entirely here for it." They named her Clara, for Dorothy's mother, which made Dorothy's sister Margaret, who had been skeptical about the whole enterprise of coming to Kansas and had come around considerably since then, very pleased when she heard of it via letter. Thomas Ellsworth, aged 2.5 when Clara arrived, regarded his sister with a serious attention that eventually resolved itself into protective devotion of the kind that would, Dorothy suspected, be both useful and occasionally excessive as they grew older. He was, in this as in most things, his father's son. The spring of 1886 was the spring that Rafe Munoz announced, with an air of enormous personal significance, that he intended to get married. The woman was a widow in Caldwell named Elena Castillo, who ran a small bakery and whose acquaintance he had apparently been cultivating for the better part of a year, with a circumspection that the rest of the hands found, in retrospect, extraordinary, given that Rafe generally had the circumspection of a town crier. Dorothy met Alina on a trip to Caldwell in April and liked her immediately. A solid, practical woman in her late 30s with warm eyes and a complete absence of nonsense about her, and she thought, of course Rafe would choose someone exactly like this. The wedding was a small affair in Caldwell, and Rafe remained on the ranch as foreman, which he had been for 2 years by then, while Alina managed her bakery. This arrangement satisfied everyone involved, including Alina, who had not the slightest intention of giving up her bakery for anything. Big Charlie Hess married in 1887 and moved to his own small operation 15 miles west, bringing Ned with him. Pete Drummond, who had grown from a shy 20-year-old into a capable ranch hand, went back to Ohio in 1886 to marry the girl he had been writing to since Dorothy's first week at the ranch, returning to Kansas with her the following spring, radiant and apologetic about leaving, and Warren rehired him for the summer and let him go with a handshake and a good reference when he found his own situation. Calhoun Briggs stayed. He was, at this point, essentially furniture, beloved and permanent and requiring very little maintenance, and he played the harmonica now with genuine skill, having practiced diligently since the Christmas of 1883, and on summer evenings on the porch his music was part of the particular sound of the Ellsworth Ranch, along with the creek and the wind and the cattle and the meadowlarks. Henry Walks Far stayed too, or returned regularly enough that the distinction seemed unimportant. He taught Thomas to ride properly at 5, with a patience and skill that Warren admired openly, and he taught Clara to name the birds by their songs when she was 3, standing in the kitchen garden with the small girl on his hip, pointing at the sky and saying names in both Cheyenne and English. And Clara repeated everything with the absolute confidence of someone who fully intends to know everything eventually. The ranch became, over the years, a place that people sought out. The neighboring families found their way to it regularly, for the practical reasons that neighbors find each other on the plains, help with a difficult calving or a broken wagon, but also for the less practical reasons, for the particular quality of welcome in the house, for the food that Dorothy Ford Ellsworth turned out with such comprehensive skill, for the sense that this was a place where a person was received as fully human, which was not as universal a quality as it ought to have been. Nathan Whitmore's family became genuine friends. The water dispute of 1882 had resolved into something better, a genuine mutual regard, and Nathan's wife and Dorothy had a friendship grounded in the pleasure of 2 intelligent women finding each other in a landscape that did not always offer that. They visited and corresponded and compared notes on children and gardening and the management of large households, and Dorothy found in this friendship a layer of richness she had not anticipated when she came to Kansas, this particular sisterhood of capable women on the frontier. There were hard times, too, because there always are. The hard winter of 1886 to 1887 that swept much of the plains cattle industry was devastating for many operations, but the Ellsworth Ranch survived it better than most because Warren had, on Dorothy's suggestion in the fall of 1886, sold a portion of the herd at a premium when the prices were high, keeping a smaller core that they could feed through the winter. Several neighboring ranchers lost everything. Warren helped where he could, offering credit and labor and food through the worst of it, and Dorothy opened the house and the pantry to whoever needed it, and she thought about what it meant to have enough and to share it, and she thought this was part of what it meant to be planted in a place and responsible to it. Thomas Ellsworth was 5 when the hard winter came, old enough to understand that things were serious, and he watched his father work through those months with an attention that Dorothy saw was formative, the way a child watches a good person under pressure and files it away in the deepest part of their character, the part that will shape them later. She was glad of it. She wanted her children to know what their father was made of. Clara was 2, and understood nothing about the hard winter except that there was more going on than usual, and that people came to the house and ate at the kitchen table who were sad in a way that she would ask about later, when she was older, and Dorothy would tell her, because Dorothy believed in telling children true things in terms they could understand. By 1888, the planes had recovered and the Ellsworth ranch with them, and Dorothy stood in her kitchen in the full June morning with the door open to the yard, and the garden coming up thick, and the sound of Thomas and Clara in the yard, and the sound of the ranch working around her, horses and men, and the creak of the windmill in the south field. And she held her coffee cup and breathed the morning air and felt the particular quality of life that she had been given here, the rootedness, the abundance. The love that was not the showy kind but the deep structural kind, the kind that holds up under weight. She was 34 years old. She was not plain in the way she had always believed she was plain, or rather, she was, in the sense of clean lines and good honest function, but she had come to understand that this was not a limitation. She was the kind of woman who kept an extraordinary household and ran the accounts of a 3,000-acre cattle ranch and made apple cake from dried apples and knew when to be silent and when to speak and how to love the people in her care with a completeness that included both tenderness and practicality. And she was the kind of woman who had come to a strange land with a battered trunk and had made it entirely and irrevocably her own. She heard Warren behind her before he spoke, his particular footfall on the kitchen floor, and she turned. He was coming in from the barn already, earlier than usual, and his face was doing what it always did in the first moment he saw her, something warm and direct that he had long since stopped managing. That was simply the way he looked at her, and he crossed the kitchen and stood beside her in the doorway, looking out at the June morning with the children in the yard and the garden bright with green, and the prairie extending beyond the fence in every direction under the immense blue Kansas sky. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said, and put his arm around her. Thomas was trying to talk Clara into climbing the corral fence, and Clara was explaining to him, with the particular authority of a 2-year-old who has opinions, that she was going to do it on her own terms and not his. Calhoun was sitting on the bunkhouse step, watching this negotiation with the serene amusement of a man who finds children endlessly entertaining. Rafe's voice was audible from the direction of the barn, giving someone good-natured instruction in a mix of Spanish and English. "The Edmondsons are coming for supper Saturday," Dorothy said. "I'll let Rafe know we might need extra hands with the horses," Warren said. "Clara needs new boots," she said. "I'll go to Caldwell Thursday." "I'll come with you," he said. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. There was nothing particularly remarkable happening in this moment. It was a Tuesday morning in June on a working cattle ranch in Kansas in 1888, and there was work to be done and children to manage and a ranch to run and a whole long ordinary day ahead of them. There was nothing remarkable about it at all. It was, she thought, the most remarkable life she could imagine. The years continued to unspool the way good years do, gradually and fully, each one laying itself down on top of the last to build something solid. Thomas grew into the boy Dorothy had seen taking shape from the beginning, capable and thoughtful, and deeply attached to the land in the way of people who have always known one place well. He had his father's patience and something of Dorothy's directness, and by the time he was 12, he was working the ranch alongside the men in the summer and spending the school year at the small school in Caldwell that had expanded in 1886 and taken on a second teacher. Clara was, as Dorothy had suspected from the beginning, considerable. She was fierce and curious, and had a will of iron wrapped in considerable charm, and she read everything she could get her hands on with a voracity that Dorothy found deeply satisfying. Warren built her a small bookshelf of her own when she was 6, and filled it from the university catalog in Lawrence, and Clara treated these books with the reverence of someone who understands that they are passages to places she has not yet been but intends to visit. Henry Walks Farr was at the ranch the winter of 1889 when Dorothy's third pregnancy became apparent, and he said, when she told him and Rafe together in the kitchen, "3 is good. This land is large enough for 3." He said it with the gravity of an observation about weather, which meant he intended it fully, and Dorothy received it in that spirit. The third child was born in the summer of 1890, another son, and they named him Robert, for no particular reason except that it suited him. And Thomas was very serious about his responsibility as an older brother, and Clara considered herself the primary authority on all matters related to baby Robert, and arranged his life accordingly. And Robert himself was an easy and contented infant who appeared thoroughly satisfied with the family he had landed in, which Dorothy thought showed excellent judgment. By 1890, the world was changing in ways that the people on the plains could feel as much as see. The frontier was closing. The cattle drives from Texas were fewer as the railroads extended their reach, and the old open range was being fenced and divided by the steady westward press of settlement. Kansas itself was becoming more orderly, more populated, the wild and enormous freedom of the early years being replaced by something more structured and in some ways less. Dorothy watched these changes and understood them, understood that the world Thomas and Clara and Robert would inherit would be different from the world she had arrived in, more constrained and more connected, and she was not sure whether to mourn the changes or simply to accept them as the way of things. Warren felt it too. She could see it in him sometimes, in the way he looked out at the prairie in the evenings, something that was not quite sadness but was adjacent to it, the recognition of a man who loves a particular quality of the world and sees it being altered. But he was not a man given to lament, and he invested the same steady, purposeful energy in the adapting ranch as he had in the building of it, selling off some of the cattle operation in 1891 and shifting part of the land to wheat, which was the future in Kansas whether the cattlemen liked it or not. And Dorothy worked through the numbers with him at the kitchen table as she always had and helped him think through the transition clearly. Rafe Munoz retired in 1892, formally, which meant he stopped being foreman and started being the man who did exactly what he wanted on a property he had lived on for 17 years and felt was half his own, which Warren made partially official by deeding him a small portion of the east land for a house, where Rafe and Alina settled, and from which Rafe could be found at the Ellsworth kitchen table for breakfast at least 4 mornings a week. Alina's bakery in Caldwell had expanded by then, doing a considerable trade, and she and Dorothy had a friendship grounded in the pleasure of 2 women who appreciate each other's competence and do not waste time. Henry Walks far visited in the summer and the spring and then, one summer, did not come back, and Dorothy lit a candle on the windowsill and left it there for a week without explaining it to the children in anything other than simple terms, and the carved horse on the mantelpiece stayed exactly where she had put it in 1883, worn smooth by Thomas's small hands over the years, a permanent resident of the Ellsworth household. They had a crew of new hands by the early 90s, younger men who had grown up hearing about the open range rather than riding it, and Dorothy received them the same way she had received the original crew, with straight dealing and excellent food, and the expectation that they would be decent. And they were, because the tone of a household is set by the people who run it. Dorothy Ford Ellsworth stood at her kitchen window one morning in October of 1892 and watched the harvest happening in the north field, the new wheat crew working in the gold and blue of a Kansas autumn, and Thomas, who was 11 now, riding the outside edge of the field with Calhoun, who was still there, still Calhoun in all his Texan solidity, and Clara in the kitchen doorway behind her asking a question about something she had read, and Robert somewhere underfoot being 3. And Warren coming across the yard from the barn with his particular walk, the walk she had known since the first morning she had arrived and watched him lean against a hitching post in Caldwell, easy and patient and sure of his ground. He saw her in the window and lifted a hand. She lifted hers in return. She thought about the advertisement she had written at her kitchen table in Cincinnati, the careful, plain words of a capable woman asking for a position. She thought about the stagecoach and the enormous sky, and the man she had apprised with practical eyes, and then fallen in love with over morning coffee and mustangs at sunset and books on a rainy porch. She thought about Rafe telling her at the clothesline that the man had not stopped smiling since she arrived, and how she had told herself sensibly that she was plain and practical, and that certain stories were not the kind that happened to plain and practical women, and how completely and wonderfully wrong she had been. She was still plain. She was still practical. She was 10 years older than the woman who had stepped off that stagecoach, and her hands were rougher and her hair had its first gray threads, and there were lines at the corners of her eyes from squinting into a Kansas sun, and she would not have traded any of it for anything. Warren came in through the back door, and she turned from the window, and he looked at her the way he always looked at her, that unmanaged direct warmth that had never changed in 10 years, and she thought, this is the whole of it. This is what I came to find without knowing I was looking. Clara, she said, turning to her daughter, go find your brother and tell him supper is in 2 hours. Clara went, at the speed she did everything, which was rapidly and with strong convictions. Warren poured himself water at the pump, drank it, turned. Good day, he said. Good day, she agreed. He came and stood beside her and looked out the window at the golden October field, and she leaned against him, and he put his arm around her. And outside the window the wheat moved in long, slow waves like water, and the sky was the enormous, unreasonable blue of a plains autumn, and the children were somewhere calling to each other across the yard. Thomas's deeper voice and Clara's certain one, and Robert's small voice trying to keep up, and Calhoun's harmonica was starting up from somewhere near the bunkhouse. Some old song about rivers and going home, and the smoke was beginning to rise from the kitchen chimney into the clear, cold air. This was the life. The whole, complete, overflowing life that she had been given when she arrived with her battered trunk and her honest advertisement and her determination to be useful. She had been more than useful. She had been necessary and loved and entirely, deeply herself, in a place that had become her own in every way that mattered. She was plain and practical, and she was the most fortunate woman she knew, and she understood now that these two things had never been in conflict. They had always been the same thing. The simplest, truest version of her own life, built from good work and honest love and the willingness to be wrong about what the future held, had turned out to be exactly what the word extraordinary means. The evening came on slow and golden over the Kansas plains, and the Ellsworth ranch settled into its familiar sounds, and Dorothy Ford Ellsworth was exactly where she was supposed to be.